Thank you for being here. As we always do, and by the way, this is our first public program since the start of the pandemic. So welcome, everybody. It's great to see you here. The pandemic is still ongoing. I don't know if you've heard. But first, before we start anything, it's always important to acknowledge that the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, as does the University of Montana, we acknowledge that we're on the Aboriginal lands of the Salish and Kalispel people. And today we honor the path that they have shown us for caring for this place for generations to come. And at the museum, we always like to add that art has always been a part of this place. So, most of you have had a chance to check out the Avis Marvelous exhibition, which is currently on view in the Paxson Gallery. And I also want to invite you to see that exhibition virtually if you want to revisit it. There's a lot of good materials online. You can actually experience the exhibition in 3D on your laptop or at your home station. And there's a lot more information on that than there is in the labels in the exhibition proper. So please join that, and you can find that at our webpage, the link to that site. So the other thing I wanted to make is a few announcements about upcoming programs at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. On October 15th, we have a complimentary exhibition that opens in the Malloy Gallery, and that show is called, it's the Spire Collection of Contemporary Art. And I use the word complimentary because it carries forth some of the themes expressed in Avis Marvelous, Ornithology, and 19th century art and science into the 20th and 21st centuries. It's a contemporary art collection, and yet rich with avian themes, human and bird interaction. So I want to invite you to see that exquisite private collection of contemporary art that belongs to Tim Spire, who lives in Helena. So that exhibition opens on October 15th, and on October 21st, we'll have a panel discussion right here in the Masker Theater to talk about art, science, and writing. So we'll have artists, writers, and scientists taking part in that presentation. And actually, one of the panelists for that is right here in the audience tonight. Her name is Dr. Angela Hornsby, who was the co-curator of the Avis Marvelous exhibition. So we'll hear from Angela at that panel discussion on the 21st. Actually, that's a good dovetail to the thank you part of this introduction. So I want to first thank Angela for her wonderful work in sharing the Philip L. Wright Zoological Museum's collection with us at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. This is a unique and wonderful collaboration for us to combine the prints from the Lee Silliman collection with the wonderful specimens and mounts from the Wright Museum. It's been a real delight. So thank you, Angela. And also thank you to the crew that's responsible for much of the work that you see on view today. So I want to publicly acknowledge Emily Grassley Scholar, Kim Spencer, curatorial intern Shannon Webb, and our gallery attendants Kane Brownice and Ronan Hoffman, who did so much to actually physically install and intellectually put this show together. So thanks to all those student interns who were a part of the process. A couple of funders need to be acknowledged here. Humanities Montana, the Montana Arts Council, and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as two very generous donors who wish to remain anonymous, who made this show possible. And finally, a great shout out to Lee Silliman, who's right here in the dark. Lee has been a very generous contributor to this exhibition, so more on that shortly. So, Lee Silliman is a retired educator, museum professional from Missoula, Montana. He holds his BS and his MS degrees from the University of Illinois. And he taught secondary level physics, chemistry, and mathematics for 43 years. And was actually a part-time photo archivist for a county museum for 26 years. And in which county was that?
Powell County.
Powell County, okay. Deer Lodge, yes. So since childhood, Lee has nurtured a strong interest in the art and history of the American West, particularly the 19th century history. And he's amassed a profound collection of prints, photographs and books related to the topic. In fact, some of his books are presently in the lobby, right? And he'll have more to say about those shortly. Lee is a Renaissance man. I think if you know Lee, you know that that is true. He is also an avid photographer since at least 1979. He built his own darkroom and frame shop in 1983 and began using a Whistler 8x10 field view camera in 1989. He is a curator, using his own photographs, historic photos from the museum collection he managed, and parts of his vintage engravings, which he's purchased over many years. He's assembled and circulated numerous exhibitions that are currently displayed in scores of venues across the country. He's been doing this since 1988. His interest in photography, calligraphy, and Western Americana have also led to editing and or writing books. He has 6 books under his belt, and he's published many, many, many articles, delivered public lectures, workshops, and also Molly classes right here in Blue Meadow. So please join me in welcoming Lee Silliman back to Montana Museum of Agriculture. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Raphael. I have 5 or 6 books out there on a shelf by the office, and you're welcome to look at any of those books after the program, especially one that I'll make mention of. So let's jump right in. The Art of the Bird, Historical Perspective on Avian Art. Before I go to the first slides, I want to tell you that I'm not really a strong birder. I wasn't a birder who collected prints. I'm a collector of prints who got interested in this subject. So in the last 3 years, I've immersed myself into the subject of birds. So I'm really not necessarily a dyed-in-the-wool birder. I have some friends like that. But it has been a wonderful journey, learning so much about birds, but we'll move on to the art of the bird. And we're going to first look briefly at art in the early time period of 1500 to 1800, and then the naturalists of the exploration, of the age of exploration, were very significant in collecting birds. That's going to be the next section. And we're going to look at America's first serious bird artist, Alexander Wilson, and no surprise, after him comes John James Audubon with his transformative emergence. We're going to take a break. We're going to take a break and look at the technology of printmaking, because most of the bird art is in the form of print. And then we're going to look at naturalists of the American Western frontier. And then I'm going to pick 6 very fine artists to look at their work a little more in detail. And I'm going to weave a number of themes together throughout the whole program. It was hard to separate them. You're going to hear the names of artists that you probably never heard of before, except for John James Audubon. Everybody's heard of him. And I really like this. I go to museums whenever I go to other cities, and I'm always astounded at the fact that I will see artwork that I think is on a par with some of the finest artists who are famous, and yet I've never heard of them. So I call them second-tier artists who might have art that is equal to some of the top names if they're an unknown person. And it gives me, I think, a thrill to find people who can create exceedingly fine art, and yet they're pretty much unknown people, unless you're really steeped into the specific genre. Artistic trends and personalities are going to be blended together. We'll cover both of those. And I want you to enjoy the art that you're going to see in this slideshow. And you should really stop and pick up some of the books I have out there and actually look at some of the reproductions. Really beautiful bird art. I have some in this program. I will tell you this program was 60 slides longer. So it was, I had to cut the wife's instructions. They were beautiful pictures of birds. Interestingly, as I suggested, most avian art is in the form of a print rather than the original artwork. That's what gets it circulated, and that's what creates its renown. And you're only going to see a very small sliver of, an important sliver of the subject. It's extremely vast. The more I studied it, the more amazed I was at how much art there is on birds of the whole world. I was just focusing on the Trans-Mississippi West birds for this collection. But when you consider all the birds in the world, it's just truly vast. And interestingly, most avian art is not in art museums. It's naturally found in natural history museums and libraries, because most of the art is a print, and most of the prints are in books. And I'm going to talk about two of the more prominent women. There are relatively few women in the time period prior to 1900 that were female, but you're going to get to see several of them. And please note that the names of birds is in constant flux from the time they were first depicted. Various artists and naturalists would make up their own names, and these names have changed. So I just either use the name on the print or a common name that's accepted now. So I don't want to really get into the naming game because it's really complex. Well, let's look at a few samples of early art from the 16th century. As you can see, it's fairly primitive. It's not really intended to fully show the bird. It's mostly kind of a decoration. Here's another set of pictures from the early art, and it's fairly simple and just simply showing, the basics of the animal. Oil paintings very rarely focused on birds. They had other subjects. I mean, obviously the birds are an adjunct to some theme that this artist had in mind. The first serious person to put birds on the printed page, I would say, was Mark Kingsby. There's his dates up at the top, and he came to the Americas twice, mostly in, as you can see, the southeastern United States, Florida there, and the islands. And he went back to London to produce these beautiful books, not only of birds, but all of the botanical samples and mammals of the southeastern United States and the West Indies. He colored those, which was fairly rare at that time, so these were all hand-colored. Basically, any avian art that's in color prior to around the mid-1800s had to have been hand-tinted, because the technology didn't exist for doing it commercially. You can imagine the effort it took to create 220 colored plates. I actually own one of the colored plates from this series here. It's an American bison on the east slopes of the Appalachian Mountains. Most people don't realize that prior to the advent of the white man, bison were found from the east foothills of the Appalachian Mountains to the west of the Continental Divide, way into the Colorado Plateau. But that's another subject. Here's samples of his beautiful work. Every one of his pictures had either an animal and a plant. I think he did an excellent job when you consider how early that was. Another sample. Naturalists in the Age of Exploration. I just finished reading a book called Sapiens, and they made note that although many people throughout the world and throughout time have traveled, it was Western Europeans who traveled with the idea of colonization. And colonization was facilitated by knowledge. So there were, in so many explorations, naturalists were taken along to bring back information about the plants and animals and the soils, the geology, the climate, the rocks. And they were like all put together. And this was like the advent of museums. Everything was just stuffed in there because it was a curiosity. It was called a cabinet of curiosities. And two countries in particular were very avid collectors of natural history specimens, the English and the French. And I'm going to give you a sample from each one. You've all probably heard of Captain James Cook, who died in the Hawaiian Islands on his last expedition. And he brought back a number of specimens of birds, and I found it interesting that since his time, 27 species have gone extinct, quite often because of the introduction of not only people and habitat destruction, but also invasive species, which are very detrimental to indigenous species. The French, here's some more pictures from Cook's voyage. Relatively few engravings from Cook's voyage, but there were some. When British explorers came back, they gave their collections to the British Museum, and to this day it is still one of the outstanding repositories of natural history objects from around the whole world. Please note that because the American colonies were British territories prior to the Revolution, and Canada was a subject of Great Britain until their independence in the mid-1800s, that a lot of North American art, natural history and art, is in London. A lot of them even went to London to study some of the specimens for his Birds of America, because it was British explorers who came back and gave it to the British Museum. I put this one in because I noticed that the British Museum put a stamp on it. Raphael, I hope you don't put a stamp, MMAC, on the artwork that comes to you. You promise me?
I promise.
Okay.
Scouts honor.
Boy Scouts honor, okay. I thought, wow, they don't do that anymore. Well, you know how we use the word aggregator for the internet these days? Well, George Louis Leclerc was an aggregator. He put together like an encyclopedia of natural history. So of course this included birds. And he actually had a 9-volume set just devoted to birds alone out of 36 books. They produced quite a few copies of these. You could buy pages, illustrations out of Leclerc's book for a relatively low amount of money off the internet. Here's an example. They're fairly crude. He just wanted to get the job done, just to get a picture and write something about it. Here is a Frenchman who became very noted for his exploration of the natural history items of the southern part of Africa. And he came back and he published a number of books, and I've just picked on the one here about parrots. And he insisted on having all of his pictures colored. This would have been hand-tinted in that time frame. It was a fairly arduous process. Most of the time, the coloring was done by women. Women were hired as colorists. They would have a master painting that showed the general color, and all of the copies thereafter were hopefully pretty similar to the master copy. Here are a couple from his book. I found it interesting that a New York gallery sold the 2-volume edition of the Parakeet volume for almost $500,000. So even though these are, quote, prints, that is, they're not original paintings, they're prints, they are so rare that command fairly high prices. Sarah Stone is one of the 2 women I'm going to go into some detail on. She was married to a naval officer who was posted to New South Wales, the southeastern part of Australia. So she and her husband spent a lot of time in Australia, and she came back and painted a number of bird prints of the birds of Australia. And I like this compliment to her that they were executed by Miss Stone, who was allowed by all artists to have succeeded in this effort beyond recognition. Very, very few women were given access to displaying their artwork in these times. And so that's quite a compliment. She was well represented in this Bavarian museum. You'll notice that part of that museum was all devoted to birds of the world in the cabinet of curiosity kind of effect. Just put everything together. And here's a couple of pictures of hers. Wouldn't you say those are fairly sophisticated for being 200 years old and more? She was a very fine artist. And I'm pleased to say that the National Library of Australia has some of hers in exhibits. There are other artwork of hers. Another sad piece of information, 24 Australian birds have gone extinct. Well, let's go back to America. Alexander Wilson was called the father of ornithology. He was the first one to make an attempt to gather a book illustrating and describing the birds of North America. Of course, this was during the early colonial period after the Revolutionary War. He was a Scottish poet, died fairly young, 1813, before his work was complete. And it was done serially, as so many of the artworks were in that time frame. It was a very arduous process to create these prints, and so you didn't like make them all and then put them out. They would do them in series, do 5 or 10 of these, get subscriptions, sell it to the people who paid their subscription fee. So it was a continual process year after year, and that's actually the pattern that Audubon engaged in. So here's some of Alexander Wilson's illustrations from his book on American ornithology. And they're very basic. They show no context. They're just usually a profile, and you get to see it. Interestingly, the ink from these hand-tinted pages transferred to the other page. If you've ever looked at old books, quite often they have a tissue between an artwork and the printed page. It's because the fugitive nature of the paints that would leach away from the artwork and would get onto whatever it was pressed against. So that's why they had those leaves. This one actually not only blended the pictures, but also some words through the page. You'll notice the discoloration there. Old paper has spotting, and it's thought to be a derivative of impurities like iron and copper and other minerals, and or a fungal growth. When I go to buy prints, if it's exceedingly pristine, I'm almost skeptical. I would say you usually should see the aging of the paper, slight yellowing, and or boxing, the discoloration. A mild amount, I think, kind of verifies the antiquity of the artwork. Well, Alexander Wilson died before the end of his project, so George Ord completed it on the 8th and 9th volume. Again, notice it's just a basic description of the bird without hardly any context to them and their lives. Charles Bonaparte was the nephew of Emperor Napoleon, and he loved American birds, and so he put out a book on American ornithology of birds not given by his predecessor, Wilson. I have a few of them. So, and also you need to make the distinction between the person who organizes the project and the artist. Quite often, like Bonaparte was not the artist, but he collected the material and he paid for the project. He was not necessarily the artist, but without him, the artwork would not have been created. Well, here comes John James Audubon. The two men actually met, Alexander Wilson and John James. Wilson came to where John James was living on the Ohio River, and Wilson was trying to sell subscriptions to his project, and Audubon showed him some of his paintings, and a friend suggested that maybe Audubon should not spend money, he should create his own birds of America. And so that's the origin story of the controversy between these two men. They were basically competitors, although the two men themselves never actually exchanged unkind words with each other. It was the followers of the two men that developed a rivalry. George Ward and finished Alexander Wilson's project. He tested Audubon, he called him an impudent pretender, and he said his birds were twisted into attitudes never seen in nature. That's hard to believe because nobody saw more birds in the wild than John James Audubon at that time. So I question Mr. Ward's criticism of Audubon. However, it is well known that John James Audubon did cut corners. Did he steal or borrow or plagiarize the imagery there? There's about a 90% correspondence there. And there's other examples. I can show you this one right here. Here is Wilson's version, and here's an exact left-right reversal of the same bird. So there are samples of Audubon borrowing from other artists, as I've shown. Well, let's see why we all know the artist John James Audubon now. It was because of his inordinate love of nature, and he saw these birds in their natural habitat. He watched them constantly. He was a very poor businessman. His businesses failed repeatedly. His wife basically had to support the family. He had 2 sons. I tell you, Lucy Audubon deserves as much credit as John James Audubon. Without her, we wouldn't have heard of her husband. She's the one that was the anchor to the family. But getting back to John, he knew everything about the birds, if you read that. Everything about their nature, their habitat, their feeding, their mating, their change of foliage, their change of feather patterns, and so on. So he was actually the first person to really look at the totality of birds rather than just, oh, here's a dead specimen, let's look at it and draw a picture. So let's compare Wilson to Audubon, and you can see how Audubon changed the format of avian art. He put them into their context. Poor Mr. Wilson is getting compared here against Audubon. Doesn't stand a chance. And I'm comparing the same species. By the way, yeah, this parakeet is extinct now. Unfortunately, it's such a beautiful one. Not only was his artwork so creative in its composition, even in the execution it was very impressive. He experimented with a lot of different medium and combined them even. He mixed together graphite, crayon, pastel, wash, ink, oil, and egg white. He even put in gold metallic powder in some of it. So his paintings just come alive with texture and brilliancy that other artists never imagined, because he was experimenting. So it took a long time. You'll notice that the Birds of America was created over a 11-year period there, and it contained 435 plates, 508 species, showing over 1,000 individual birds. And I put the word unbound for the installments. These were created in an installment plan to the subscribers. And they were handed these things as paper. And we all think of Audubon's books. The owners of these had these bound thereafter. And I kind of get off onto a little tangent. I know that some of the prints that I collect, that you see in these frames, they were originally in books. But they were created separately from the books. And the books were put together, the artwork was put together with the word. But I feel like it's not a sacrilege to separate the art from the word as well, because they were created separately too. The Birds of America, perhaps slightly more than 2,200 copies were made. Please remember now, every one of these pictures had to have been hand-tinted. So we're talking about 435 times over 200. That's a lot of life-size artwork to hand tint. Recently, a copy Birds of America went for $9.6 million. Does anybody know where the closest copy of Birds of America is by Audubon? Anaconda, Montana. The Hearst Library has a copy. I used to go there while my daughters took piano lessons, and I remember seeing the Audubon book. It's now not on display there. Next time I go through Anaconda, I'll have to stop and make arrangements at a time to see if I can see it for pages. Anybody seen the books of Anaconda, the copy of Anaconda? Well, he died. He had dementia the last 5 to 10 years of his life, and the French were very proud of him. You know, he had a French father. He grew up in France, and he came to America in his late teens to escape conscription by Napoleon's army. So the French really considered him one of their own, and rightly so. And when he died, this is one from my collection. I remember the portraited reproduction of one of his more famous pictures. Now, here's another sad part of the Audubon story. He always kept his original paintings from which the engravings were made. So, upon his death, his widow had 474 original paintings. She could not sell them. Nobody would buy them. She offered them to the government. I think she tried to sell them in England. She finally sold them to the New York Historical Society for $4,000. I got out my calculator. That's $8.44 for an Audubon. Audubon, I just saw an Antique Roadshow last night, an Audubon portrait of somebody. He did portraits to put bread and butter on the table. He wasn't entirely dependent on his wife. Jesus did most of it, but even so. They estimated for a sketch by Audubon of a man, a portrait was be worth $150,000 at auction. So, yeah. Anyway, poor Lucy, she survived not only her husband, but also her two sons. And I think it's very unfortunate that she had to live in poverty at the end of her time. But at least I'm glad all of the artworks ended up in one institution. Unfortunately, I need to go back. Unfortunately, you cannot go and see this scene. They do not display them anymore. I looked on the internet today. They only show a handful at a time, maybe a dozen or less, and they don't do that very often. There are no Audubons on display now. I would have loved to have gone and seen the original watercolors that all of the prints were driven and stuff. Anyway, the copper plates, 78 remain of them today. Most were melted down or scrap. And notice I get a transference of left to right in the print. Oops. I'm going to take a break here now and talk about the technology briefly. I want to go through fairly quickly. These are overlapping time periods here for these different technologies: woodblock, copper and steel engravings, and then aqua tint and stone lithography. And chrome lithography is a subcategory of stone lithography. And there's two kinds of printing: relief versus intaglio. And on the relief, the ink is on the raised part and comes off on the paper. And on the intaglio, the ink is in the grooves and comes off onto the paper. So there's two kinds. Woodblock engraving was done on boxwood. I found it interesting that you have this big round globe of water, and when the light comes through, it focuses on the piece of wood, which needed intense light to carve these wood blocks. So here's some examples of wood block. You notice they're fairly linear because they're literally carving lines in the end grain of wood blocks. Here are copper plate printers at work. Copper is a fairly malleable substance, and you can scratch it and do artwork on it. And you have to print them one at a time, so it's a very personal, slow process. Aqua tint is very interesting in that it's a use of acid and resin, and it gives you a granular structure. And I like to show you this print by Wagner. I enlarged this section right here. You can see how granular it is. That's what aquatint does. It's not linear. So here's a bird picture. You notice there's no linearity to it. It's all very much textured with granular structure. Makes for very beautiful artwork. Lithography is based on the repulsion of oil and water on a limestone block. And it came into the fore right after Audubon did his Birds of America on copper plates. So from the middle of the 1800s on, for the rest of that century, lithography on stone was a preferred method. It was quite a process, so often the engraver, the lithographer, put his name on the artwork as well as the artist who created the original artwork that was copied onto the plate, onto the stone. So you'll notice over here we have the artisan starting to do the drawing from the original, probably watercolor or oil. And not shown in here are the women who then hand-tinted the picture afterwards. For me, it's a little of a pet peeve to say that the artwork was by the engraver. For me, the artist who did the original picture is the first person who should get credit, and then the photographer second. That's the way it goes. Okay, so here is how it goes. Here is Audubon's life-size watercolor, and then they made double elephant folio, huge prints. And when the bird was too big for the page, he'd make the bird lean over or be squatting or nesting or whatever. They're all life-size. And then to facilitate a wider distribution of his artwork and to make more money, they had octavos. And the Audubon prints in this exhibit that you have here are octavo. And octavos were created by the cameralists who and you look through this device and you see both a larger original and you can draw a smaller version. And that's how you can create a nearly identical, smaller replica of anything through this process. I think it's very, it should strain somebody's eye. Homo Lithography became very popular beginning about in the late it started in the 1850s. I have one in my collection from I think 1852, but it came into its fore in the early 1870s. And every color has a different stone. So you can see here, this is the final product, but it's the union of 9 different colors from 9 different lithography stones that are perfectly registered. So you get a very, very beautiful picture. And this one is in the gallery. You should take a look at it. And there's a number of Homo lithographs. What was nice about this is you can make many multiple copies. So Homo lithography vastly increased the number of pictures that you could print at a given time. And so it exploded the use of color. And I want to take a little break here again, showing you something that you might find useful. The Biodiversity Heritage Library, it's on the internet, and they have reproduced pages and pages of literally hundreds of important books, mostly from, well, they all were prior to 1923. And so a lot of the pictures you see that I have in this slideshow that you can enjoy on your screen at home come from Biodiversity Library. So if you ever want to look at some beautiful pictures, put the title and author of some of these old books on Biodiversity Library, and you can see some of these. There were a number of surveys in the American West. I'm not even going to, there's just 6 of them. They all had naturalists assigned to them who came back with specimens and artwork and created these beautiful pictures that illuminated the report. Titian Ramsey Peale is a favorite of mine because he was the first artist to see a lot of these animals in the American West. Pardon me while I have a drink. In the lower right-hand picture, you'll see the path taken by the long expedition that he was a part of. He basically came to the Colorado Rockies over here. And he painted not only birds, but also mammals. And I'm pleased to say that I actually have one of those in 3 prints in my collection. But being able to say, I actually saw these in nature instead of a dead specimen brought back by somebody, I think is pretty special. So I like Titian Ramsey Peel's artwork. He also was assigned as the artist on the United States Exploring Expedition, which went all the way, actually south enough, far enough south to be in the Antarctic waters. It came up the South American coast on the west side and up the Pacific coast of the United States to the Pacific Northwest. So some of his artwork has North American works in it. And John Kirk Townsend was a good naturalist and artist, and he was on an expedition with Thomas Nuttall. He's very important because he brought back a lot of specimens for John James Audubon. Audubon was extremely grateful because Audubon wanted to have every bird in North America, and these men had returned with literally hundreds of specimens of animals, including birds. And fortunately, Audubon got his hands on some of them. There's an interesting story behind this one. Townsend shot at California condor and it fell on the other side of a river. So he stripped his clothes off and swam across the river. The bird was wounded, it wasn't dead. And when he got there, he had quite a struggle killing this condor because it was so big and vicious. And there was a Native American village nearby, and they heard all this commotion, and so the men and women came to see what was going on. Here was this silly white man with no clothes on trying to kill a condor. They thought it was pretty funny and hilarious. And that condor is now in the Smithsonian Institute. Unfortunately, he probably died at an early age because the substance he was using for preserving the specimens was arsenic, and they weren't quite as aware of how poisonous it was. The Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia was a repository before the Smithsonian started. It predated the Smithsonian, and so they have a lot of specimens from the early 1800s there. Well, the Pacific Railroad surveys, they all had naturalists and geologists, topographers attached to them. When they came back, they published a lot of illustrations, mostly landscapes, but also, I think there's around 27 bird photographs, all of which I'm pleased to have in my collection. And here's some of the artists that helped paint some of the pictures that these explorers brought back. These two men, Swainson and Richardson, basically were Canadian explorers and naturalists. Mr. Richardson was the field man, and Mr. Swainson was the publisher. And well, I tell you, that would be a good example if you go to the Biodiversity Library on the internet and call up the Fauna Borrelia americana and see some of these just beautiful, beautiful samples of birds as well as mammals. Another extinct bird. All right, artists of the Golden Age, John and Elizabeth Gould. This man was the aggregator and she was the artist. He gets a lot of credit for getting everything together and publishing it, but he wasn't always as generous in giving credit to his wife and others who were the artists that made his publications possible. Just look at all these publications through his lifetime. And he was able to do that because he was the curator of the Zoological Society, which had access to a lot of specimens. And notice what Elizabeth illustrated, including, as we're going to see, the zoology of the boys of the HMS Beagle by the famous Charles Darwin. The husband hated to use the word Elizabeth, so on the credits he only said Elizabeth instead of giving her full name. No credit in that book. She did every picture. Isn't she very, very fine? I mean, if I had told you these were audubons, would you have believed me?
Yeah.
Probably would have. Has anybody ever heard of Elizabeth Gould before they walked in this one? Another fine artist, Edward Lear, said Gould owes everything to his wife and me, basically. And Mr. Selby said, I like Elizabeth's illustrations as well as Audubon's. We really love hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are a north and south, western hemisphere, North America, Central America, and South America. There's about a dozen or so in North America. But look, many more in Central and South America. And the Europeans went crazy over hummingbirds. I was camping a couple of weeks ago, and we were all sitting around eating our dinner. A hummingbird came right in around us, 2 or 3, 4 or 5 feet away. And in fact, my grandson said a hummingbird came up and was like this far from his face, looking at it. Maybe thought he was nectar. Just incredibly fine artist. Edward Lear was another artist that of the time period. This was the golden age in the middle 1800s. And let's take a look at some of his works. Toucans. Again, I strongly urge you to go home and when you have a spare hour, go to the Biodiversity Library and look at the titles and authors of some of these volumes and look at some of these beautiful pictures that I've lifted and put onto the PowerPoint here. Joseph Wolfe was another very fine avian artist, worked at the British Museum. I believe I have a Joseph Wolfe turkey. They called it the Mexican turkey. Again, they thought it was a different species than what we now consider the American turkey. I'm very pleased that I can say you actually can go and look and see some of these prints by some of these artists in the other room. William Guilford is another very fine British artist. Notice these are original watercolors now. These are not prints. Charles Barney Corey. He was the son of a wealthy mercantilist, and he was able to devote his entire life to the study of birds. And he created a volume of strange and beautiful birds of the world. He had 19,000 bird specimens that he donated to the Field Museum. And I'm very pleased to say that this big print here is the pride and joy. It's at the far end of the gallery. It's the largest print in the collection that you'll see. He only printed 200 copies of this book, and I don't think there were more than a couple dozen birds, maybe 3 dozen birds in the edition. And so it's really rare for these to ever come on the market, and I was able to buy it because it had some blemishes around the outside. Its condition was not premium, and I overmatted them. But the image itself is clear of most imperfections. So you're going to see a fairly rare print at the far end of the gallery there. Beautiful and curious birds of the world. Of course, the dodo is extinct. And John Gerard Bruins, Dutch illustrator. Notice they congregated in England. That was the epicenter, I would say, of avian art in the 19th century, excluding John James Audubon. He found his birds got better reception in Europe than in America. although that's not an American bird, obviously. Isn't that on par with Homo Lithography? Well, I've just showed you a tiny, tiny fraction, the tip of the iceberg. Just to show you how many books were created in the 2 centuries from 1700 to 1900. This book, which my copy is out there on the shelf for your inspection, it has 62 pages that list books of avian art, and there's 12 to 15 books listed on every page, so do the math. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of books during those 2 centuries illustrating birds. Sometimes other things too, plants, other animals, and sometimes plants. But that is quite an astounding thing. I just couldn't believe page after page of all these books with beautiful bird pictures. And it was helpful for me in my search. So this is my last slide. I put Audubon at the center, and the galaxy of other artists surrounding him, but I don't think they're hardly could be called very much less than Audubon. He had the genius, I think, of putting them together in their natural habitat first, and became very rightfully famous for that. But these other artists, I think, who preceded him and who came after him deserve a lot of credit for their fine artistry. And that is the last slide. So I'm finished about when my wife picked and I should have lived. We have a question and answer period?
Yes. We have a little bit of time. Are there any questions for Lee?
Yes.
Why do you think that birds were so popular as a subject for so long?
So you're asking why were
birds so popular as a subject for so long?
I think from their beauty. I think it's very simple, and I'm just speaking as a non-serious birder. I just think they're so beautiful. And of course they have the freedom to fly through the air that the rest of us don't have. They have such freedom and mobility. They just seem like they're the masters of the air. And we envy them. Even though we have machines that can fly now, it's not the same as the birds. That's just how simple that's it. Angela.
So I'm curious, where did all this lead? It seems like there's a big community of people who were all doing avian illustration, and eventually we got to the point of using cameras instead. But was there kind of a transition period, or what did that look like?
I think photography is one answer. Photography supplanted artists as recorders on explorations. Another issue is I think the subject got covered so well, artists transitioned into other subjects, Impressionism, and it's not part of the triad of oil paintings and architecture and sculpture. So I think it had a niche and it flowered, and as most things, they die away. I mean, how many times have you gone to an art gallery or walked by stores and seen avian art for sale? Probably fairly rare. So I just think we've moved on to other subjects. That's just my shooting from the hip theory. The gentleman in the back here, yes?
I presume that they were all generally painting from specimens on a table in front of them, as opposed to in a plein air kind of setting.
Yes.
So I wonder to what extent the accusation made about that Audubon sometimes put the birds in unnatural poses, because it could be true, but it seems that way to me if I look at some of the.
I think some of the other artists might have had some field studies, where they actually were there to see some of these birds, and they have written descriptions. They were tasked with creating the artwork to go with the publications, and so they would read the words as well. But I would agree with you, it'd be a bit difficult to be an artist at the British Museum and create a scene like Audubon could. I think that's why he still is so outstanding in his field. It's because he had a lifetime of observing all of these birds, whereas some of these other people, they did see some of the birds in their natural environment, but a lot of them were from specimens, and they were at somewhat of a disadvantage. Any other question?
I had the same question actually.
Okay.
Lee, just a question about Audubon's Octavo series.
Sure.
Does that Octavo refer to the eighth of a plate?
Eighth of a page.
Eighth of
They're
a
one
page?
eighth, basically, they're approximately 1/8 the size of the elephant folios size.
And those were much more affordable.
Yes, the Sons took that project on because by that time Audubon was senile and or dead, and they went through several iterations. The Sons did because they were poverty stricken basically. I mean, they were poor. They made a lot of money, but they had so much money to create these projects too. All the paper, the ink, the subscription efforts, and so the Octavos were made to give the ordinary person, or at least maybe a middle-class person, the opportunity to own some Audubons, and so they were much less costly. And they did several editions. There's actually a whole book out there on, I don't know, 300 or 400 pages on all the different details about the various editions from the original elephant folio through all the Octavos. You can still, I'm not a millionaire, I bought most of these Audubon Octavos for anywhere from $2,500 to about $300, so it's not totally out of reach. They made large numbers of copies of these Octavos, and that's another reason. An intact set of Audubon's Birds of America in the Octavo size, you could probably buy for under $10,000. So they're out there.
Lee, is it fair to say that at the start of Audubon's career, these prints were actually sort of elite endeavors? That really, it was only the highly wealthy or
Yes.
institutions that could afford these things. But by the time he was done, that it was actually quite democratic, that it actually had moved into the hands of the common people.
Right.
Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. And George Catlin preceded him, or was contemporary with him, painting Indian pictures. In the beginning, these large portfolios were only affordable by the very wealthy and the influential, the royalty. And so that's why relatively few copies exist today. And that's why the Octavos were generated to not only to make money, but to get them out into more hands, spread the word around. I think I saw one more hand here. Yes.
There's a spectacular sunbird in India, Bhutan, named Mrs. Gould's sunbird. Was that named after Elizabeth Gould?
I would take a guess and say yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. There's a bird with the name Gould in it. In which country?
South Asia.
South Asia. And the question was that probably named after Mrs. Gould? And the answer is yes. That's a good question because it leads to the observation that a lot of birds, either in their common name and especially in their scientific name, are named after notable naturalists and artists. In fact, I have a whole list, I think, there might even be books to that degree, of animals named after people who were important in the study of those things. So, Raphael, I think I looked at
Any other questions?
7:30.
Well, thank you, folks. And thank you, Lee. This was